I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about right-wing populism of the 1990s, led by such figures as David Duke, Rush Limbaugh, Pat Buchanan, even Ross Perot, and many others. My guest today draws a line from right-wing populism of the 90s to what we see today. My guest is John Ganz. John Ganz writes and he's the only writer. It's his newsletter, Unpopular Front, which could be found on Substack, and he is the author of the book When the Clock Broke: Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John Ganz, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for having me, Mitch.
You know, David Duke is a name that we're all familiar with, takes a leading role in the narrative that you tell in this book. And I had always thought of David Duke and seen David Duke. And I remember I was in my 20s in the 1990s. I remember David Duke then. And I always just sort of saw him as a relic of the past, you know, this former grand wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and just sort of somebody from the past. Even though in the 1990s he wasn't that old, he's still alive today. But your book has made me rethink that a little bit. Not only is he maybe a relic of the past, but in the 90s he was almost, in a way, before his time.
Yeah, I think that's a strange phenomenon that I observed with a lot of the things in my book. The title kind of deals with the peculiarity of things, of time feeling out of joint. But absolutely, David Duke seemed to be a relic of the Jim Crow past, being a former KKK wizard, and he was also a neo-Nazi and was a relic of the 30s and 40s. But many people, and including himself, viewed him as a sign of where American politics might go. I think that, there's some reason to believe they were onto something. The main characters of my book, including Pat Buchanan and some of the writers that he drew inspiration from and had friendships with, viewed David Duke as a signal that their moment perhaps had arrived.
That's interesting. So it was recognized, especially by his supporters, that this is on the rise.
Oh, yes. And I think also in the broader political culture, I think there was some, this period was maybe the last golden age of print media. You had some very sharp commentators. Now, I think the Duke phenomenon, there's two ways to look at it. In some ways, perhaps it was overly blown up by the media and he was put on television when he ought not to have been. I mean, we can think about lots of parallels between that time and our own. But he also, people recognize that the popularity that he was, or the energy that he was channeling, perhaps said something that was afoot in American politics. And that wasn't only, people who wanted to emulate him. It was people who feared and wanted to defeat those politics. They said something is up here. And he represents a very dissatisfied amount of part of the American people. And he had echoes elsewhere. I mean, Pat Buchanan's campaign was explicitly based on his run, and was taking notes and copying things from David Duke. But the Ross Perot, I think, was a reflection of a similar moment when a certain kind of reactionary populism really swept the country at large. In the end, David Duke does not win his election. He gets 55% of the white vote, which is remarkable because this man was a Nazi, even in Louisiana, which has, a long history of racist politics. And he doesn't become he becomes a national phenomenon in the media. His own presidential race doesn't go very far. Buchanan's is, and much like, Gene McCarthy in the 60s or Ronald Reagan in the 1970s, he is able to mount a kind of protest primary campaign that wounds the the incumbent, and shows that his own constituencies are not pleased with him. And then Ross Perot is
He wounds George Herbert Walker Bush.
yes, exactly. And I think that he wounds him, and then he kind of wounds him again when he's brought back into the coalition and gives a very angry and frightening speech at the RNC, the culture war speech, as it's called now, which presented the country as falling apart, which is not exactly what you want your message as the incumbent to be, which is doom and gloom, and we're heading over the precipice. And then Ross Perot, comes off of the cable news channels, and there was a time during this election where he was enormously popular, and it looked like he might even be the first successful third party candidate in American history. He was leading both major party candidates at certain points. So there was something afoot here, where people were looking for a populist candidate and wanted to kind of irrespective of what their programs or ideas were, which were sometimes very vague or contradictory, but wanted someone who was a rejection of the political establishment, or represented from, in their mind, a rejection of the political establishment.
We're going to get into the 80s because it's an important backdrop, but I want to ask you first, when you look at figures like David Duke, Pat Buchanan, even Ross Perot, and you see their ideas and how their movement still holds today, and obviously it probably has grown. Is that akin to how we see what happened in the 60s with Barry Goldwater and the Republican Party, which is this sort of insurgency movement that's considered fringe still in the 60s, but finds its culmination with the election of Ronald Reagan in the 80s?
Well, yes, I think there is a parallel to be made. Obviously, their politics are slightly different. My book, I'm very much influenced. He's a kind of a mentor to me by Rick Perlstein, and his account of the kind of strange defeat of Barry Goldwater, where people wrote off his movement as fringe and ultimately, bringing the Republicans down. But it was actually, the future could be seen there. I think there is an obvious parallel in the way I think about things. I have a way of thinking about American politics that influenced by this book and working on this book, which is, you can kind of see the future on the fringes. So it's, it's customary to just say, well, the mainstream is what matters, and the fringes are things that you just push out and ignore. I think that, first of all, these things are always changing. There's always a process going on. Second of all, what's on the fringes represents, constituencies with thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. And those concerns maybe don't have the right messenger, maybe, become more salient to a larger group of people. But I think that what I was trying to, the story I was trying to tell in this book, and the message I'm trying to give to people, is that, to be an attentive reader of politics, you also need to pay attention to small movements, to fringe figures. They are not just curiosities. They are not there, and you ignore them at your peril. They represent, even though small, real parts of the political landscape, and as we've seen, they can come back with greater force and are always out there churning, organizing, mutating. So yes, I think there are obviously differences between the conservative movement as it came out of the Goldwater campaign and the National Review and those institutions, created more lasting organizations, and we're really good at this kind of creation of civil society organizations, publications, magazines, newspapers. I mean, this stuff also happens on the far right as well, as a lot of very good books that have recently come out have shown. This politics that I'm talking about creates less organizational depth, perhaps, than the old conservative movement, but it is sort of what's underneath a lot. Like, I think that the elites of some of these of the conservative movement had a misreading of what the grassroots really wanted. And, Republican politicians said, "Oh, there's all these angry people out here. I know what they want. They just want tax cuts, and they want free trade, and they want, less regulation. And they're fed up with the federal government, telling them what to do." That certainly was something that sometimes resonated with their constituents, but I think what they were saying was something quite different. And who really understood that was Donald Trump. And he said, no, you keep on putting words in these people's mouths. I know what they want, and they don't like you very much, and they don't want you in charge. Insofar as you bend the knee for me, maybe you're okay. But, Trump has a real relationship with the needs, wants, the emotional tenor of the Republican grassroots and the conservative grassroots that no other Republican politician gets close to.
Let's turn back to David Duke and talk about his politics of the 1990s. He runs for governor of Louisiana in the early 90s. He loses, but is considered a legitimate contender for governor. Previously, in the late 80s, I believe it is, he actually serves in Louisiana's state legislature. He's a former leader of the KKK, a neo-Nazi, but he does repudiate his involvement with the KKK and the neo-Nazis when he's running in politics, and I think he has ever since, though he does run on a platform against affirmative action and does talk a lot about white people being discriminated against. So tell me about the politics of David Duke in the 1990s.
Well, David Duke, let me just say, David Duke's repudiation of neo-Nazism and Klan involvement was thin and easily punctured. He was selling neo-Nazi books out of his legislative office. He was still going to meet with the Populist Party, which was a party organized and that he ran
outwardly. Let me just outwardly neo-Nazi books. I mean,
Mein Kampf and
selling Mein Kampf.
He was selling Mein Kampf and the Turner Diaries out of his legislative office.
Oh,
yeah.
The Turner Diaries are important. I mean, this is just off the top of my head, right? The Turner Diaries is almost a fictional book, right? About
it's a novel, America. But it's basically a terrorist handbook for starting a race war. Timothy McVeigh was a big fan of this book. And most of the people on the, domestic terrorist far right, look to this book for inspiration. So he was selling these books out of his legislative office. He was meeting with the Populist Party, which was organized by Willis Carto, who was an American neo-Nazi and the kind of the brains behind organized Holocaust denial in the United States. So his denial of his neo-Nazi past was pretty thin and easy to look past. He spoke. What was interesting is that he spoke not much differently than a conservative Republican at the time, talking about crime, talking about welfare, complaining about affirmative action, quotas, set-asides. He was more willing to hint at the explicitly racial underpinnings of his ideology. And he talked, when he moved onto the national stage, he spoke about, in coded terms, about sort of globalist institutions that didn't have America's interests at heart, that were, conspiratorial forces that were, opposed to the historical legacy of the American nation. So those messages were there, a little bit more subtle, but didn't take very much to scratch the surface and see that he still essentially had those politics, even though he might. I mean, he lied, which is many politicians lie. His lies were not particularly hard to discover, but he had a talent, not as big as the one of this guy now, for lying blatantly and seeming to get away with it, which drove his opponents and people who were frightened and rightly concerned about him totally crazy. They said, why can't we make anything stick against this guy? Ultimately, they did, because, there's an enormous amount of black voters in Louisiana. They didn't want to see this guy win. People, business in Louisiana said, if this guy wins, it's going to really hurt our economy. People are not going to want to come down and invest in the state that's, run by this neo-Nazi Klan guy. And that appeal eventually works and defeats him quite soundly. But the thing that, was the signal to a lot of people was the strength of his appeal, the fact that he got so much of the white vote. And the other thing is how much the Republican Party establishment struggled to stop him and to push him out of the party. I mean, and to say we have nothing to do with them. They really could not do it. When he was running for a local state legislature seat, the RNC got involved in that race, and that's kind of to stop him. And the president recorded a radio ad. The Republicans were very concerned about this insurgency within them, even in this kind of little local election. They were like, this is not good. They threw a lot of firepower at him and couldn't quite stop him. The internal Republican Party politics couldn't end David Duke, either on elite or a mass level. He was defeated by the electorate at large, but he won the Republican nomination for these two different offices. And nothing Republican politicians did or said could seem to stop him. And that sounds a little familiar, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If you go back and you look and listen to his statements in the 1990s, they wouldn't be out of place today at Republican, at least pro-Trump Republican rallies, including Trump rallies. And a term you hear a lot, not just from David Duke, but Pat Buchanan and others, is America First.
Oh, yes.
And I keep in mind when I say that, there was an America First movement in the first half of the 20th century, sort of a fascist movement led by Charles Lindbergh. Mm-hmm. Were they conscious of that when they said the word America First, of linking it to?
Oh, yes. Pat Buchanan is certainly conscious of that. I believe he views himself. I know he views himself as the descendant of those politics, as the continuer of a true conservative tradition that goes back before the war, that goes back to Lindbergh, that goes back to America First. That views that as the real American right that's been betrayed by moderates and neoconservatives. That adoption of that slogan is done quite self-consciously, definitely by Buchanan, and I think the extent to which Duke used it. When Trump uses it, there are definitely people around Trump, surrogates, advisors, who know exactly what that means, and what that comes from. When after the election, Buchanan's committee during his primary campaign was the America First Committee, which was an immediate callback to Lindbergh and America Firsters. So definitely they want to continue the unfinished work in their mind of the pre-war right, which was anti-interventionist, which was much more friendly to the rise of fascism in Europe, which had explicitly fascist coalition members. And, of course, Lindbergh was a Nazi sympathizer.
So they were explicitly fascist, the America First movement. I called them a fascist movement, but sometimes we call people fascists, and they deny it.
Yeah, I think that they wouldn't have said that they were. I don't think. Father Coughlin definitely got there, and I don't think that Lindbergh would have said I am a fascist, but he had, ties to the Nazis. He was a scientific racist who viewed Nazi racial ideology favorably, was an anti-Semite. And there's a famous quote by FDR. He was talking to one of his advisors, maybe Felix Frankfurter or something like that, and he said, if something happens to me, know this in my heart, like, I think Charles Lindbergh is a Nazi. So FDR in private, this wasn't just a political attack against Lindbergh. FDR truly believed Lindbergh was a Nazi sympathizer at the very least, and there's a lot of evidence in that request. He didn't go up there and say I'm going to create the kind of system they have in Germany and the kind of the United States, but the message was clear to a lot of people.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with John Ganz. John Ganz writes the newsletter on Substack called Unpopular Front, and he is the author of the book When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990's. The title of your book, When the Clock Broke, comes from an essay called Break the Clock of Social Democracy. I'm sorry, that's not the title of the essay, but I think that, I'll let you clarify that. Anyways, the title of your book is influenced from a man that I had never heard of before named Murray Rothbard. Who is Murray Rothbard?
Murray Rothbard is a real eccentric character in the history of American politics, a person you would say is a crank and on the fringe and really should not have had that much influence. He was born in the Bronx to the child of Russian immigrants. He comes from a time period, he grew up in the 20s and 30s, time period when many Jewish families in the Bronx were communists. His own extended family was no exception. He himself and his father were kind of free market conservatives or libertarians. He, at Columbia, he starts the Students for Strom Thurmond group, which was in 1948, when the Dixiecrats are getting going. He in the 1960s makes some very strange alliances. He's sort of pushed out of the mainstream of the right for being isolationist, for being quite eccentric and quite obstreperous. And he makes some strange attempted alliance with the New Left because of opposition to the Vietnam War and to a sense that a shared anti-statism, a shared critique of the bureaucracy. This doesn't work out. He gets disillusioned or fed up with his New Left allies. Said, their egalitarianism is ultimately nonsense. It's against nature.
Who is he trying to work with from the New Left?
He was trying to work with the Progressive Labor Party in New York, which was a Maoist group. He was trying to work with some Trotskyist groups. He was, and some people, Ron Radosh, who was a new leftist, he became a neoconservative, but was, a part of his circle. There are a number of other people who, some of them started off as right libertarians and then enter the New Left. And Murray wasn't happy about some of the people from his side defecting. Some things happened the other way where people kind of left the New Left and moved rightwards. But yeah, he had those ties to the New Left. These relationships did not work out. He becomes one of the people who's founds the Cato Institute with the Koch brothers. He's pushed out of that because he's too difficult and he's too ideologically intransigent. And when Buchanan comes along, well, he writes an article. This was the inspiration for the whole book, in a certain sense, the discovery of this article, called Right-Wing Populism in 1992, which is his reading of what the Duke phenomenon is. In that he says it's a vulnerability of the Republican establishment. It's a return of these older politics. And there's an opportunity for us libertarians here as part of this coalition. And that continues in his surrogacy and his support for his buddy, Pat Buchanan, who he served as an advisor to. And he gives a speech at the John Randolph Club, which was this organization that brought together this group called the Paleo Conservatives, which were these America First conservatives, and Paleo Libertarians, which is what Murray Rothbard and his group called themselves. And he gave this rousing speech that brought everybody to their feet that said, we're going to break the clock of social democracy. We're going to break the clock of the New Deal. We're going to repeal the 20th century. And I thought that image was just so wonderful that that became the title of the book. Arguably, to a lot of liberals and leftists, they said, well, what does that mean? Reagan had already ruined the New Deal. The work had been done. But he meant something even deeper. He thought that, the kind of civilization, American civilization as it had been constituted post FDR, and could be uprooted, and we could go back to the country, say, that existed around the Coolidge administration, both in its ethnic makeup and its policies that seemed to him to be more desirable. So he's animated by a deep hatred of America as it had, become what we think of as its greatest years in the American century, as an industrial powerhouse, as a leader in the world, as a prosperous society that offered a decent life for its citizens. To Rothbard, that was an anathema and the worst times in American history. Times which people now look back with quite a bit of fondness and says, well, how do we get back to that point? He wanted to go back, to the kind of really to the Gilded Age, when there was untrammeled and unrestrained capitalism. He didn't even like the progressives. He thought they were uptight, busybody, New Englanders who were trying to fix everybody's lives and up in everybody's business, and they should have just let capitalism rip. So his opposition to progressivism or liberalism goes back even before the New Deal to the progressive movement. He hated them. So yeah, and I say that advisedly, hate, he was animated. This was emotional for him, and the way he expressed himself was powerful and emotional, and the crowd responded to it. He had a vision. This was not just about policies. This was not just about what he would prefer to see happen. If he was a cabinet member or his guy was the cabinet, he had a vision of what America meant and should be, and the country as it had become was not it.
Where is this discontent coming from in the early 90s? This is just shortly after the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Yeah. I mean, are they discontent with Ronald Reagan, or they are? Tell me more about that. What's happening in the 80s to create this discontent of the 90s on the right?
A lot of these guys. So, it's interesting to think about Reagan. We think about Reagan as, this was the creature of the conservative movement who became the president. They couldn't do it with Goldwater, but they got Reagan. Actually, on the new right, during the 1970s, Reagan wasn't really their first choice. He had been a kind of a pragmatist in certain ways. I mean, obviously ruled from the right, but in California, better than I had made certain pragmatic decisions as a politician, which they didn't like. They liked John Connolly, who'd moved very hard rightwards. They they liked, I forget his name. There was another candidate. I should know his name off the top of my head. Who they were more interested in, and Reagan was as kind of a squish to them, but they got on board with him in the end, and they said, "This is as good as we're going to do." So there were many people within the conservative movement who Reagan was, not totally reliable politically. And they also differed in affect, in tone. Reagan was unusual in a way for a conservative in his sunniness, and his optimism and his belief that things were going to get better. He kind of melded certain features of FDR's politics or political style to the conservative movement. So at the end of the Reagan era, they viewed it as a bit of a wash and a failure. They thought Reagan had moderated too much. He had been absorbed by DC, and that they needed a messenger who was more ideologically pure than even Ronald Reagan, who we think of as one of the most ideological presidents in American history. But it was something else. Pat Buchanan looked up to both Nixon and Reagan, but found them wanting in certain ways. He, unlike a lot of conservatives, didn't like Richard Nixon. They thought he was too much of a pragmatist, too much of a liberal, which is strange to think about now. He thought he saw something else because he knew him intimately. So he saw the Nixon we heard on the tapes, not just Nixon sounding presidential. And Pat Buchanan said Watergate was a liberal establishment coup against the true tribune of the American people, and it was a missed opportunity. It was a missed opportunity. He should have done a counter coup of some kind against these people. And then with Reagan, he said after the Reagan years, when he was kind of setting up his own political career, the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan, and it's a vacuum he sought to occupy. And it's true, there was a constituency, there was a grassroots, there were people interested in these ideas, and were discontent. The other thing to think about Reagan is that his policies hurt many of his own constituents. People had voted for him happily twice, but the state of the American economy in 1990, 91, and 92 was not good, both because there was a recession and also wages had stagnant. The long wage stagnation had begun. Unions were broken. There was an enormous rise in bankruptcies and foreclosures. And you would expect, the natural thing would be, those voters are going to move leftwards again. Not necessarily. They were open to a dissident message that didn't come from the left. And I think that that's another really important thing I would like people to take away from the book is like the revolution doesn't always come from the left, unfortunately. And understanding that dynamic of why people who, you would think, these policies have really hurt them. So they're going to, vote for a liberal Democrat again, a New Deal Democrat. They'll be like, well, we'll get things back the way they were before. Not necessarily. Yeah.
Does this there's Rush Limbaugh too, another obvious figure that's wildly influential and powerful in the 90s. This is the height, really, right, of his moment. Is this movement of right-wing populism, it's also having an effect on the Democratic Party, isn't it? I mean, we get into the 90s, we have the Bill Clinton presidency. I think it can be argued through the presidency, maybe not at the very beginning, but during it, Bill Clinton would effectively move the Democratic Party much closer to the center.
Yeah, I think that process begins even in his candidacy. I think that did some harm to the overall political landscape of bringing the Democrats too far to the right. Let me answer this like this. The right that Clinton moved the party towards was more of the Reaganite right of free market solutions. Ultimately were the wave of the future. Free trade, transitioning America away from trying to more gently transition America away from a manufacturing economy, with job training and ways of, sort of a more compassionate way of looking at the working public than a Republican says, well, they're bums, so let them find another job. More like, oh well, we'll help you in certain ways. I don't think I think the jury is in on that. The verdict is in on that, and it created a period of superficial prosperity in not a dissimilar way that Reagan did, although maybe it was more broad based. But didn't create lasting structures of American prosperity and stability. And some of the things that it did created the appearance of prosperity, but set up future problems. So in the 80s, you begin a wave of financial deregulation. Clinton continues and in some ways really accelerates that. And this sets up, you have a little financial crisis in 1990, 91, where you got, junk bonds and savings and loan collapse. And you have all these like speculative practices that created a bubble and then, threatened the entire economy when that exploded. It's relatively small compared to what we saw in 2008, but in some ways you can see that there's a dress rehearsal, the hints of it. So I think some of the lessons were not learned of the previous decade in terms of what the country needed to get on a sound footing. I think people, and they were forgotten and lost. I think in the era, my friend and mentor Rick, he gets a lot of mileage out of tweaking, making fun of pundits and saying they were out of touch with what was going on in America. I have a very different take. I think in the era I write about, there was a lot of early smart journalism going on, and they knew that there was something, something wasn't feeling right in America, and they were talking about it a lot. And, the election happens, the economy improves with Clinton, people feel pretty good, prosperity. I mean, there's obviously, things, subterranean things still going on. And people kind of forget this moment and how bad it felt and how scary it felt. You're in California, especially in the, I recognize you're up north, but in Southern California, the end of the Cold War meant just a huge amount of carnage because the end of the aerospace industry. You got 40% job losses in that sector. The country has, a pretty bad unemployment in the early 90s. It doesn't look like, on paper that bad. It gets close to 8%. But in Southern California accounts for 25% of all job losses in the nation. You had this kind of regional depression. And then this is happening a lot of different places in the country. And then it's not so shocking then that you get the Rodney King riots, which happens in an LA that is undergoing intense poverty on top of this, constant police oppression. And I think that, these things happen, these explosions happen, and then people kind of go, well, that's over. And the roots and the issues that gave rise to them aren't really addressed, and I fear that will happen now, is that Trump could fizzle any moment, in my view. He's never been a super popular figure. His movement is much more fragile than I think, liberals and leftists sometimes think. It could fall apart. It could go away. Some kind of normalcy could return to American politics, but we could say to ourselves, that was weird.
I feel that way too, but I felt that way for 8 years almost now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So maybe it's here to stay, but I think that a lesson I would like to impart is that when things seem to exit the stage or seem to go underground, follow them, continue to follow them, because they're still out there. It's not going to disappear. I think it's just like what I learned. Basically, this whole project was a kind of like civic education for me. I'd always been interested in politics. I always followed politics, but I realized that my knowledge of it was when Trump came along. I realized I didn't know enough about my country, in the history of my country, and what my fellow countrymen were up to and what they were concerned about. And I kind of was like, okay, I need to understand. And again, what I learned was that it is very important to pay attention to things that are marginalized, to things that are, are dismissed as crankery, because they represent perhaps, in negative ways, but real constituencies, real concerns. And yeah, I think that, whatever happens with Trump, I think he's a uniquely talented, sounds strange to say that, politician in certain ways, who's very good at channeling all these energies. And, I think lacking his personal charisma, these things become fragmentary again, but they're going to still be out there.
One last question about Murray Rothbard. In the essay, Right Wing Populism, doesn't he lay out that you need some kind of a bombastic character, figure, leader in order to bring on this sort of quote unquote revolution?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He talks about the need for a demagogue, and he says you need a rousing, charismatic figure to go around the media elites, go around the intermediary institutions and talk directly to the people. And his inspiration for this, in part, was Joe McCarthy. And, most people who, are Cold Warriors look back at McCarthy and say, well, there were some commies out there, but McCarthy really took it too far. He was so crude. He was a demagogue. That's not really the way it ought to have been done. Murray Rothbard says, no, you got it backwards. The crudeness, the demagogy, the menace, the attack on the establishment elite that he was able to do on television without the mediation of the newspaper editors, is exactly the point. That was the good stuff. That was what McCarthy represents, and that's what should be emulated. And that image was like, that was when, I kind of got a chill reading this, and I was like, oh my God, that's Trump. They are describing that. And it wasn't, Buchanan wasn't quite the right guy for it. David Duke wasn't quite the right guy for it. They needed someone who had the skills and training of an entertainer, not a politician, to be able to pull this off. So yeah, that part of the essay to me gave me chills, and that's when I thought it was so essential to bring it to. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier in the interview, but I found this essay and I thought it was really important, and I wanted to bring it to everybody's attention. I was writing people. Nobody wanted to pay attention. And it turned out to be very fortunate for me, because then I had to write about it, and I wrote this book, which was a wonderful experience. I'm very glad I did it. But I was trying to get people to pay attention to it, and they weren't. And then I was like, I got to do it myself, I guess. So I started to write about Murray Rothbard, and I started to write about the paleocons.
Does his essay have a shelf life, or is it something that just for you found, or is it something that people continue to go back to within the right-wing populist movement?
I don't know. That's a good question. So I will say this. When I was starting to do the research that ultimately led to the book, one of the reasons why Rothbard interests me is because all these alt-right guys, that name isn't used that much anymore, but all these alt-right guys who went to Charlottesville and were coming out of the woodwork with Trump's election, to a man, these guys are Nazis, explicitly so. To a man, they all said, what set me down my political road was Murray Rothbard. And that, really piqued my interest. And I was like, well, I got to understand this. I got to figure this out. Are people still reading Rothbard? Well, there is the current, I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's the president or the prime minister of Argentina. Milei is a big fan of Murray Rothbard, and his strategy in politics definitely was looking at this right-wing populist stuff. So this has overseas. I think another figure who I talk about in the book who was friendly with Rothbard and friendly with Buchanan, Samuel Francis, is someone who is read with a lot of interest by young intellectual conservatives now. And they'll tell you that. They'll write essays about it. But then when you look at what Francis actually said about himself and what he said about his vision for the country, it's pretty disturbing that he's read. And, speaking of Rush Limbaugh, Rush Limbaugh, not much of an intellectual, but during the 2016 election, he reads a part of a Sam Francis essay on the air. So these ideas are definitely still out there. Rothbard is perhaps of more interest to people who consider themselves radical libertarians, and there are fewer of them now. I think most people just move straight into right wing populism. And are more interested in Sam Francis. But the description of the vision of politics that he articulates in that essay, I just thought made an indelible impression on me and made me, started me down this whole road.
The reverence for McCarthy and McCarthyism is interesting. How widespread do you think this is? And this is just my personal impression. I feel that there are shades of McCarthyism, shades of McCarthyism today when it comes to how House congressional committees are being used, especially when it comes to schools.
Absolutely. I think that that's a deliberate adoption of that playbook. I think that, Murray Rothbard's not the only person on the American right who with a positive vision, who had a positive memory of Joe McCarthy. There's been a long time an effort to revise the narrative about McCarthy as a hero, that he was not that what liberals said he was, that he was unfairly maligned. You will find many conservatives writing favorably or apologetically about McCarthy. I do believe you're absolutely right that the way that congressional committees are being used now on issues of diversity, DEI, and critical race theory, they keep on trying these kind of McCarthyite purges and movements. So yeah, I think that the ghost of McCarthy hangs heavy over the right. And even if they're not conscious of the lineage of the politics they're practicing, I'm certain some of them certainly are. He's one of those defining figures.
Are you paying any attention? I think it's called Project 2025.
Yeah, it's disturbing. Yeah, I mean, the
Is
types
this from
of
the
people.
Heritage Foundation?
Yes. Basically, Sam Francis basically says the old conservative reliance on the courts and the Congress and the Senate and these is a sentimental attachment to parts of the American tradition that no longer are relevant. That's old conservatism. We're going to do something more radical. We're going to seize the executive branch and use it as a hammer against our enemies. And that way of thinking has really taken over the entire conservative movement, which is that you don't just, we don't like the executive, we don't like the bureaucracies, we prefer local control, local power. No, they said, okay, we're gonna take these institutions over and we're gonna use them to reshape the country in our image. And a lot of that is really stretching the American constitutional system to its very limits and not exceeding them. There are a lot of people on the right who explicitly say they want Trump to be a kind of Caesar or a dictator because they believe the situation in the country has gotten so bad that it requires a kind of emergency strongman leadership to step in. And you see that idea again in the time period of my book, still on the fringes for the most part, but not exactly on the fringes because Ross Perot represents a similar urge, although less explicitly ideological, for an emergency strongman who needs to take the bull by the horns and get the country back to where it should be.
As somebody who looks at history, could you imagine, and I'm asking you just to imagine here, 30 years from now, another historian looking back at something like Project 2025, linking it to the 1990s and sort of doing this?
I hope so. I really hope that, this book will make some kind of contribution to the way we understand American history, and that is a way post. It's one of the sources. I mean, that's sort of what could hope for. I mean, I'm sure, and if I'm lucky, in very short order, people will come along with books that criticize my thesis and revise it. But that will just be that it made a contribution to the understanding, and now we have to revise that contribution. I do hope sincerely that like future historians look at my book as an important source, an important way of understanding that time. And yeah, I think from the story, as far as I understand it, there's a very direct connection between the era I write about and the present. Future historians might disagree, but I'm very curious to see, and very hopeful that the book will be taken seriously in that way.
John Ganz has been our guest. Again, John Ganz writes and publishes the newsletter Unpopular Front for Substack, and he is the author of the book that he's joined us to talk about called When the Clock Broke: Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John Ganz, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.